All right, we are talking about Amazon's Lord of the Rings series, Rings of Power, has already betrayed Tolkien's original vision. This is going to be a doozy. Stick around for this one. Shane, tell me what's happening right now, dude.
Yeah, it's, as soon as they showed the picture of that dwarf.
With no beard. No gosh darn beard.
With no beard, but also she was black. And so I think that got people a little bit like, whoa, what's going on, right? And so there's a lot of people who can nitpick what's going on, but there's actually a lot more issues inside of this Lord of the Rings series than people realize. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting that somebody brought up, because I kept thinking, like, what's the big deal? Who cares? Who cares what color they are? I don't really matter, It doesn't bother me.
Right.
But then somebody brought up a really good point. They said, what if you did some sort of like Middle Eastern some story, some old what am I trying to think of here?
Oh yeah, like Aladdin or Arabian Nights. Right.
Yeah, like mythology. If you like did some mythology from like the Middle East and you had white people doing it or Asian people doing it or Native Americans playing the roles, it just wouldn't be right.
Wouldn't make sense, right?
Right, because that's their mythology. and so J.R.R. Tolkien's mythology, the Lord of the Rings, if people don't know this, the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and all that he wrote it as Great Britain's mythology because they didn't have a mythology of their own like the Greeks or the Vikings, or the Orient. They didn't have a mythology, and so he wanted to create one. And arguably, that mythology, there's a certain way that those people would look, I suppose, if they were to eventually, become. And I guess they mostly would be light skinned or white.
Yeah,
that's what people from that area are from.
Yeah, someone said on Reddit, like, what if Patton Oswalt was playing Black Panther? How would you feel about that?
Well,
and I was like, that's ridiculous. And then I realized that when I said that's ridiculous, I sort of answered my own question. Oh, I guess that is ridiculous.
I mean, sort of. I mean, Black Panther is from Africa. So, I mean, I think we're talking about, instead of a location, we're talking about like a mythology. So it really didn't make sense to me until somebody said, well, let's say imagine you had a Native American mythology and you had, black people playing the characters. Would that make sense? You're like, well, no, because it's a Native American thing. It should be all Native American people, right?
Right.
When you look at it like that, then that kind of makes sense. And so I get that. How important is it that this is looked at as a mythology? I'm not 100% sure. We do know that J.R.R. Tolkien was writing this as a mythology, but it isn't the mythology of Great Britain. It isn't like accepted that way by all people, right? But that's the way he wrote it. So what they're saying is they're ignoring his intent for his stories by doing this.
Yeah, someone brought up on that same thread, like you're talking about Egyptian mythology, right?
Right.
Or whatever. If you're talking about Egyptian mythology, it should be Egyptians or people of that similar persuasion playing those characters. And if you look at that big blockbuster, Gods of Egypt, where they had like a bunch of white people and stuff, they noted how that didn't make any sense, and I agree with them. Gods of Egypt was not a great movie, and it wasn't just because the characters didn't actually match anything. Like the guy playing Ra was the blue-eyed, blonde-haired guy from Game of Thrones.
Makes no sense.
Makes zero sense. But the story was also a mess. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that those things should be criticized if the casting makes no sense, and it shouldn't be a racist thing. It should be this being critical because the casting doesn't match up to what those characters should look like, or even what they were described as, or where people expect them to be, where they're from, or the mythology, whatever. It doesn't match up. Whether the story is good or bad is a whole nother story. But like, You can criticize something for bad casting and not be a racist.
Right, and so the warning sign here is that they specifically cast people of different ethnicities because they wanted, because people of all ethnicities like Lord of the Rings. So it's not, you don't have to be white or, whatever to like Lord of the Rings. Everybody likes Lord of the Rings.
Sure. Yeah.
And so they said, well, I mean, and this kind of makes sense. You're like, well, I mean, we want everybody to be able to identify and enjoy the Lord of the Rings.
Sure. Yeah.
Which makes sense. I mean, I'm an advocate for having, a white dude on Star Trek Discovery. So that way I can, identify with that character in some way.
Right.
So I get that. The problem is like, if it was that J.R.R. Tolkien's intention, and are you changing his story by doing this? I guess is the real question. Are you changing what his intent for his mythology was? I know that in another way they are doing something very difficult. They are changing things because this is happening over really what would have been a 200-year period. And the problem is that the humans will all die inside of that 200-year period. By like season 2 or 3, the humans will be dead. So they are adjusting the time period.
Right.
So they're already making concessions outside of what Tolkien intended for his story. So the question really is how much license do people have to change things? One said, look, if you want to change Wheel of Time, fine. If you want to change, I can't remember what the other series was. You just said it a moment ago. The big series on HBO everybody loved.
Game of Thrones.
If you want to change that, fine. But you're talking about changing like the Bible of fantasy, which is what Lord of the Rings is.
Right.
The Bible or the Quran, whatever you want to call it, of the fantasy universe. This is it. So that's why people are getting frustrated and upset, and over the change in the characters and not having bearded dwarf ladies.
Not cool. Honestly, not cool.
It doesn't really bother me a whole lot. I mean, I'm used to like Drizzt Do'Urden, and the whole, he was a dark elf character, and I know those have been added upon. They were not part of J.R.R. Tolkien's original characters, the dark elves. So I don't really. It didn't bother me a whole lot. They are bringing hobbits into this, which at the time there were not hobbits. So they're using the Harfoots, which are talked about as hobbits, but they weren't actually supposed to be there. So they are adding things and changing things. What do you think?
I think that I'm going to say what I always say. Are you doing it to tell a better story? Or are you doing it to look good on Twitter?
Okay.
If you're doing it to look good on Twitter, then don't do it. That's the wrong way. That's the wrong reason to cast or to make decisions about anything, especially when it's a lot of people. I love that fandom. You're going to waste a lot of money. You're going to wreck your fandom in the process because you are making decisions based on social identity and Twitter, the thumbs up, and not based on telling a good story or doing the actual IP proper justice. Because if you make good stories and you respect the IP when you're creating something new from something old, then it's going to be successful and everyone's going to love it and you're going to make more money and it's a win-win-win. If you utilize the platform of a rebooted IP to try to push some kind of social narrative, well, some people might like it. Most won't. You're not going to make money, and the odds of that continuing forward are much, much lower because the company that's financing you isn't going to want to lose money every time you decide you want to make a point.
I mean, but I got to give, I got to say this to the point of credit is like, if they did it for the purpose of inclusion, just to the fact of they wanted to be inclusive. I mean, I like the idea of just being inclusive, period.
Sure.
Like everybody gets a shot, everybody has a chance. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I like that idea in general. And if that was their intent, then I'm not going to then that's fine. We want everybody to be a part of this. But they have to ask themselves whether they're being true to it. And one of the things that was interesting here is that I guess it came out, the OneRing.net has been around for, I guess, more than 20 years. And they've been moderating discussion forums and social media platforms around the Lord of the Rings. And this person says, I've witnessed the attacks of racists, bigots, and trolls on the Lord of the Ring.net, many social platforms. And being a person of color, and finding myself at the receiving end occasionally, I have grown accustomed to ignore and accept and move on. But this person said, yet the avalanche of unveiled, blatant, shameless racism that hit our social platforms like a massive wave last week shook me. According to this Vanity Fair article, Tolkien scholar Mariana Rios Maldonado says, obviously there was going to be push and backlash, but the question is from whom? Who are these people that feel so threatened or disgusted by the idea that an elf is black or Latino or Asian? I wondered about this myself. Who really are these self-appointed gatekeepers of Tolkien's works, and what conceit leads them to believe they possess this automatic authority? I don't think it's fair to think that people feel like they have the authority to determine what is Tolkien's works, but my question to them would be, well, what makes you think you have the authority?
Right?
If fans don't have the authority to change it, why do you have the authority to change it? Because they're letting you do a show? Does that give you the authority to determine what it actually is? How about we use the source material and let that determine what it's supposed to be? I mean, in my opinion, that's what that is. I mean, if people are being overtly racist and saying, hey, I don't want to see no black elves, well, that's dumb. But if they're saying, I don't want to see black elves because, there were no black elves, then okay. I mean, is that racist by saying that? I don't know.
No, it's not racist. And as you were speaking, when you were saying that, I purposely didn't interrupt you because I was like, I'm not going to interrupt you. He's on a roll. But my first thought was, who are you to decide? Like,
right.
Why
do you get to decide?
Yeah. Why do you get to decide? Who's deciding who decides? This young person gets hired, walks into a franchise, and decides she's gonna, well, why are you the bastion of what's gonna happen with this particular IP? I mean, are we deciding based on who's been a fan longer? If that's it, I think a lot of people have got you beat. I mean,
yeah, I mean, I think maybe his family. I mean, they did sell this, so. The family got $250 million selling this second age material to Amazon. They made a lot of money off of it.
Right.
But they're still probably likely the people who would know more of the intent of their grandfather or whatever, or granduncle, whatever. So I would say that they would know whether or not that would be the case. And,
now, to that said, though, the creators can do whatever you can do. Whatever, if you were given the responsibility of creating something, then do whatever you want. Do whatever you see is fit to tell your story. However, if you want to be successful, what we talked about before, respect the IP, respect the story, and go out of your way to tell a good story that respects the IP that you have been gifted with. You've been honored with telling stories from, because if you don't, that whether you like it or not, if that is not respected, it's not going to be successful. It's not going to make money, and which means that your job you're going to be out of a job, and we're not going to get any more Rings of Power, if it's a complete flop, and that's what it's looking like it's going to be. And if it is, you think Amazon's going to fork out another $500 million to make a second season?
That's a good point. And it's okay. So, I mean, it's the time we live in, apparently. I mean, it just must be that, because I'm going back and looking at the Vikings TV show that aired 2013 to 2020. And if you look at the IMDb on that, everybody's white. Because Vikings were white.
Right.
So obviously you're not going to have a bunch of people of color as Vikings, because they weren't. Just like if you were doing today, hopefully, I mean, in the past they did it. Movies about Jesus were played by white dudes. I hate to break it to you, Jesus wasn't white.
And he was like Middle Eastern, right?
He's Middle Eastern, bro. He's a
Jewish. He was Jewish.
Jewish, Israeli. Yeah, Israel, Palestinian, that whole thing there.
Although I know some I'm part Jewish. I know some Hebrew guys that look very white.
I mean, they look that way, but I'm just saying actually R is.
Right.
You know what I mean? And if you live over there, you tend to look like that. So it would be weird to do a movie today about the Middle East and not have all Middle Eastern people in those roles. So the real question here is Tolkien fantasy, make believe, or is there some sort of logical standard based on it? And unfortunately, as much as we know what Tolkien's intent was, for it to be a mythology. So if you go based on that, then you have to say, yeah, it's likely that the characters would be lighter skinned people. Do I feel personally that there's any reason why we can't have different races of different colors in there? No, but just as long as it's not overt and done to assuage the society today. If that's why it's being done, then don't do it that way. Do it because, we want to have inclusion and it makes sense to the story or for whatever reason. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
That's it. I mean, that's all I can say about that.
I mean, yeah, and you have good points. All right, well, let's wrap up this story. Let us know what you guys think in the comment section below. On the way down, hit that subscribe button because a lot of you aren't subscribed. And listen, everyone's point of view is completely respected here. You are allowed to have a point of view that's different than ours, and vice versa. And we just want to have a conversation. Just keep it respectful, and obviously, don't be racist. But have a conversation about the topic.
Yeah, I mean, listen, if you're a racist, you need to seriously consider your situation in life. I'm just going to say right now, people are people. If you don't like somebody because of the color of their skin, then you need to go look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself some questions and get away from people you're around.
On that note,
really think about it.
Most people aren't one race anyways. So.
Not anymore.
Nah.
Yeah.
We're all the grays now, man.
The grays.